skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. And by the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
Thanks, Bill, but I intend for this to be a briefing, as in brief. But thank you for coming. I really appreciate that. I'll be telling the story of the Avenger, its combat debut, and the men who flew those aircraft into battle. I'm happy to take your questions, but please hold them to the end. I'm going to do something that I normally consider to be a hanging offense, and that's I'm going to read parts of the slides to people because we have folks who can't quite see the captions. Our story starts with a brand new Navy squadron, Torpedo 8, commissioned in September of 1941 under the command of John Waldron, Lieutenant Commander. The squadron was designated number 8 because it was to be assigned to the USS Hornet, aircraft carrier number 8. Every one of the squadrons in the Hornet Air Group at that time was 8. Thus, we had Fighting 8, Bombing 8, and so forth. John Waldron was the kind of man you would want to follow into combat if you knew you had to go. A contemporary assessment of him reads, Waldron commands the respect of every man in the squadron. He takes care of his men, well-liked for his wry sense of humor, a gallant fighting spirit. He knows his job thoroughly, and his job was to deliver torpedoes against enemy ships. Torpedoes, we see a mock-up here of the final successful version, were considered to be the primary anti-ship weapon against anything, but unfortunately, this is the successful version. We didn't have a successful torpedo in 1942. The Hornet was even newer than Torpedo 8, commissioned the next month with Captain Mark Mitcher in command, and the air group would fall under the command of Commander Stanhope Ring. Ring's participation in the Midway battle would be controversial at best. Torpedo 8 and all the torpedo squadrons in the Navy at that time were equipped with the Douglas Devastator, the TBD. The TBD had been an amazing aircraft in 1937. By 1941, it had been completely surpassed technologically. That's how fast aviation was moving in those days. But it speaks to John Waldron's leadership that he browbeat the Navy into providing the twin gun mounts intended for Dauntless dive bombers for his aircraft. All the other Devastators in the Navy were flying with a single machine gun aft for defense. The torpedo bomber, ordered by the Navy in early 1941 from Grumman, would remedy a lot of the deficiencies of the Devastator. It was far faster and had a 50 caliber machine gun in a power turret for defense. Designated TBF by the Navy, torpedo bomber, F for Grumman. The aircraft was named Avenger a few days before the Pearl Harbor attack that December. The Pearl Harbor attack resulted in John Waldron driving the squadron even harder. And Waldron had already been driving the squadron as if they were going into battle the next day, according to one of the men. But John Waldron was not a despot. Again, he took care of his people. He and Adelaide hosted parties, and Adelaide was always helpful to the young wives of the squadron. The Avengers became available at the factory in Bethpage, New York, starting in February. Torpedo 8 would be the first squadron to be equipped with the new airplane. All was going well until March 4th, when the Hornet suddenly and without explanation had to get underway. We now know that Hornet was leaving to go deliver Jimmy Doolittle in his raid to Tokyo, but of course, very few people knew that. Waldron made the decision to split the squadron in half. He and the more experienced pilots would stay with Hornet. The newer guys would stay behind with the second in command to accept deliveries of the airplane. Here we see the first aircraft off the assembly line, 8T1, aircraft number 1 of Torpedo 8. While this is going on, the Japanese Navy is planning an operation to accomplish the final destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The final plan was typically very complex. It actually included a separate operation against the Aleutian among its many moving parts, and the timing was absolutely crucial. The Japanese were relying on surprise and the fact that the U.S. fleet would remain in Pearl Harbor until both the Aleutians and Midway had been attacked, thus luring it out to its final destruction. Of note, when the Japanese wargamed this operation, a junior officer playing the Americans actually sortied the fleet from Pearl Harbor before the Japanese attacked. He was overruled by a senior. The enemy will not be aware of our plans. Another factor affecting this operation would be the fact that 2 of the Japanese carriers in Kido Butai, as the first carrier striking force was known to the Japanese, would not be available as a result of damage in the Coral Sea battle, and thus not available for Midway. In May, Admiral Nimitz visited the islands, asking the Marine commanders and the Navy commanders what they would need to hold the island against an amphibious assault. The result was Midway wound up with significant reinforcements, and the defense of the island was on a lot of people's minds. While knowledge of the code-breaking effort led by Commanders Joe Rochefort and Edwin Layton that revealed the Japanese plans to Admiral Nimitz, it was apparent to anyone paying attention that Midway was a likely target. The fall of Wake Island in December was a bitter pill for the Marines and the Navy, and Wake had been a hard-fought battle by only 400 Marines. Midway wound up with about 2,500 Marines, thanks to Admiral Nimitz. But again, Midway is between Wake and Hawaii. Anybody paying attention is going to notice that. Here are some of the reinforcements that Admiral Nimitz provided. Brand new Army B-17s, the E models. They would greatly enhance the island's search and reconnaissance capabilities, but despite expectations and some, frankly, outrageous claims later, the B-17s were ineffective against Kido Butai, but their attacks would compound the Japanese problems. Also rushed out to Midway were Army B-26 medium bombers, jury-rigged to carry torpedoes. They had been part of an ad hoc experiment in Hawaii to see if a B-26 could indeed carry and launch a torpedo. And they did. Midway would wind up with so many aircraft, it soon became a difficult problem to find space for them. Back to the men of Torpedo 8 left behind. They accepted deliveries of the Avengers as Grumman provided them, learned how to fly the aircraft. A few even got to participate in live torpedo drops as part of the acceptance process. This work took until May. The detachment then flew these aircraft all the way across the United States, getting them to the West Coast, getting themselves and the aircraft aboard a ships actually, bound for Pearl Harbor. They arrived about 36 hours after the Hornet left for an unknown destination. Now, we now know that Hornet sailed to help ambush the Japanese fleet, but of course, very few people knew that at the time. The Hornet was part of Task Force 16, together with USS Enterprise, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. The Yorktown was the center of Task Force 17, commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher would be in overall command of the U.S. forces afloat during the battle. All three carriers were the Yorktown class. The Avenger detachment was ordered to send 6 aircraft to Midway as a final reinforcement. Every man in the detachment volunteered. The senior officer, Swede Larson, was forbidden to go, so he chose Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling to lead the flight. Good choice. Langdon Fieberling was another man you would want to follow into battle. Like his role model, Skipper John Waldron, Fieberling was described as the kind of leaders others would willingly follow into hell. And that's exactly what they did. At 0700 on the morning of the 1st of June, the 6 Avengers departed. Because of the long overwater flight, 2 places in the aircraft were taken over by officers from Patrol Squadron 24, who flew the PBY Catalina, and thus had extensive navigation experience in overwater flights. For once, the detachment was on time. Arriving at Midway after a long but uneventful flight that day, they quickly exchanged the fuel tanks in their bellies for torpedoes and set off to enjoy the hospitality for which the U.S. Marine Corps is famous: tents, cots, sand fleas, and warm beer. These are the men who would be flying into battle with the Avenger. The detachment stood to before dawn every morning, pre-flighting their airplanes, running the engines until they were warmed up and ready, and then stood by their aircraft until they were relieved sometime after dawn. Lieutenant Fieberling met with Colonel Kimes, the Marine Air Commander, who wanted to launch a coordinated strike against the Japanese once the carriers were located. Fieberling objected, not wanting to wait for the Marine aircraft and their less experienced crews. The TBF had a speed advantage, and Langdon did not want to sacrifice that. This was a Torpedo 8 detachment, but not all of the men were from VT-8. Ensigns Wilkie and Hissam were the 2 PBY officers chosen for their navigational experience to fly out with the detachment. Jack Wilkie would fly with Langdon Fieberling, and Joseph Hissam would fly with Ozzie Gainier, the other section leader. A last-minute contribution from the patrol squadron there at Midway was Petty Officer Lionel Orgeron. Langdon Fieberling replaced Machinist First Class William Coffey in Darrell Woodside's plane because Fieberling did not want to risk losing the squadron's engine expert. So Petty Officer Orgeron stepped up. Bert Ernest's 2 crewmen, Jay Manning and Harry Ferrier, like the rest of the det, explored Midway. There were a lot of aircraft to look at: the tired Marine fighters and bombers, the B-17s, and those B-26s jury-rigged with their torpedoes. Later, Harry and Bert decided to upgun their Avenger. They put masking tape on the wings like the Marine fighters did, and then carefully inked holes in the middle of the masking tape for gun barrels. The 2 pilots flying on Old Langdon's wing are Ensigns Bert Ernest and Ensign Charlie Brannon, longtime friends and roommates. One of the other pilots, Darrell Woodside, was an enlisted man, a naval aviation pilot, common in the Navy in those days. These NAPs were usually among the most experienced and skillful in any squadron. On the 3rd of June, the Japanese invasion force was sighted by Catalina. The battle was drawing near. Bert Ernest and Charlie Brannon decided to check out some of that Marine beer in the supply tent. But the taste of warm beer from a can wasn't quite to their liking. So they decided to turn in. On the way to his quarters in the twilight, Bert sighted a piece of paper in the sand on Midway. Turned out to be a $2 bill. Bert had never seen one, but he decided it might bring him luck, so he put him in his pocket. On the 4th of June, the detachment manned up before dawn, ready to go. They were still in their aircraft when they got the news that Japanese carriers had been sighted by a PBY 150 miles northwest. All the Marine fighters took off to defend the island, and Langdon Fieberling led the TBFs onto the runway right after them. The 4 Army B-26s were close behind. Both groups took off and headed straight for the Japanese carriers, not waiting for the Marine bombers. As they headed out, Jay Manning told Bert that he could see the Japanese carrier aircraft striking the islands. Fieberling led them straight to the Japanese carriers, flying about 160 knots, 4,000 feet, straight as an arrow. Again, the Army B-26s close behind. Neither group had coordinated with each other. They just launched. At 6:55, the Avengers sighted the Japanese carriers, and the Japanese Combat Air Patrol sighted them. At least 30 of the vaunted Zero fighters, some of the best fighters of the time, flown by some of the best pilots ever, fell on the 10 American aircraft. The jet dived, headed for 200 feet, and now at 300 knots. The Zeros attacking aggressively, and the gunners fighting back. 1 Zero each was shot down by the Avengers and the Marauders, but otherwise the battle was all in the Japanese favor. The Japanese were dismayed to find both types of aircraft fast and tough. The only effect they seemed to be able to get were from their 20-millimeter cannon firing explosive shells. On the left side of the formation, Bert Ernest was the first to be shot down. Jay Manning was killed by a cannon shell, and Bert was wounded in the neck. The aircraft hydraulic system had been shot out, dropping the tail wheel in front of Harry Ferrier's tunnel gun. As machine gun bullets and cannon shells ripped through the airplane, the radio was shot out, the compass disabled, the instrument panel shredded, and the elevators no longer responded to the stick. The other Avengers flew on to attack the Japanese carrier Hiryu. You can see them depicted by the red arrow there. Bert knew he'd never make it that far, so he dropped his torpedo against a Japanese cruiser. You can see that lone attack with the cruiser evading. He dropped his torpedo against the cruiser, at least he hoped he did. He thought he did, but he couldn't be sure. He had dropped his bomb bay doors early, so at least they were open when the hydraulic system went out. All 5 of the other Avengers flew on against the Hiryu, managing to drop 2 torpedoes, which the carrier avoided. To the west, the 4 Army B-26 bombers attacked the Akagi. They managed also to launch 2 torpedoes, which were also evaded by skillful Japanese ship handling and the fact that the carriers were about as fast as the torpedoes. 2 of the 4 B-26s were shot down. Despite having flown the Avenger for fewer than 100 hours, Bert Ernest's training kicked in. Maybe headed for a crash landing, but a landing still requires a checklist. As Bert ran through his checklist in his mind, his hand went down to the elevator trim tab, part of the routine. As he moved the wheel, the airplane responded. All of a sudden, it's not headed for the water. Now, all Bert's got to do is shake the last couple of zeros trying desperately to shoot him out of the sky, avoid the anti-aircraft fire of the destroyers and cruisers, and find his way to Midway, somewhere down southeast, sort of that away. Bert knew he had to fly south, and at some point he'd have to fly east, or there's nothing but ocean ahead of him. Harry Ferrier, who had been knocked out by a bullet across his forehead, finally came up on the intercom. Bert first asked about Jay Manning, and Harrier told him Jay was dead. After that, Bert asked Harry to look into the radio, and Harry confirms that the radio is indeed shot out. Next, Bert asks Harry to look into the bomb bay to see if their torpedo had actually dropped. But Harry couldn't see anything because the sight glass is covered in Jay Manning's blood. Harry asked if he could come up into the rear cockpit behind Bert, and Bert told him to come on up. As the Avengers are being shot down, John Waldron was leading Torpedo 8 in their Devastators off the Hornet. Waldron had had a heated argument with Mitcher and Ring, asking for fighter escort, which was denied. The fighters would stay with Ring and the dive bombers, and saying their planned course, almost due west, would miss the Japanese. I know where they are. They're going to be farther to the south. Ring told Waldron he was in charge of that mission, and they would fly the course he designated. As the Hornet Air Group assembled over the carrier, burning precious gas, Waldron made a decision. And when the Hornet Air Group formed up and turned west, John Waldron soon turned southwest, headed straight, as it turned out, for the Japanese carriers. Waldron's course was soon validated, and the need for fighter escort would soon be proven as well. I'm sorry for the busy slide, but we got to depict the Hornet Air Group's flight to nowhere, as it came to be termed. This blue arrow shows the Hornet Air Group under Ring and with Mitcher's concurrence, flying a course nearly due west. Waldron flew southwest, the green arrow, pretty much straight at Kido Butai. He had to turn right a little bit, but he flew straight to the Japanese task force. The result is that except for Torpedo 8, both from Hornet and Midway, the Hornet's air group would miss the entire battle that day. Midway is shown down there in the blue triangle to establish the relative position. What's even worse is that Mitcher and Ring lied in their official reports about the course flown by the Hornet Air Group, the result of which was that as the Hornet fighters escorting the bombers all ran out of gas and went into the water, the rescue planes for those pilots were misrouted, and several pilots who could have been saved were not. Some would later say that Fieberling's attack was futile. 5 TBFs that got within range of the carrier shot down with all hands, and only 2 torpedoes launched against the Hiryu by the Avengers and the Akagi later by the Marauders. But the attack attracted the attention of the USS Nautilus, the largest submarine in our fleet. Commander Bill Brockman heard the noise, saw the smoke, and headed his boat straight at the Japanese carriers. Now, the Japanese cruisers and destroyers thwarted all of his attacks, but it was nevertheless yet another thing for the Japanese fleet to deal with, and the destroyer, the Arashi, specifically tasked with keeping Brockman away from the carriers, would later lead the Enterprise Air Group straight to them. It was the wake of the Arashi that one of Wade McCluskey's group had seen. Without that wake, McCluskey and the Enterprise bombers would have missed the battle, and Enterprise accounted for 2 of the Japanese carriers hit that day. Burt Ernest's navigation, his turn to the east, was soon confirmed because the Japanese had set fire to Midway's oil tanks. So he had a nice big column of black smoke to guide him in. Now all he's got to do is get the airplane down, a task that's complicated by the fact that only one main landing gear came down and locked using emergency procedures. Midway did not want Burt to put that wreck on their runway and told him that in no uncertain terms, but his radio's out, so Burt didn't hear him. And yet there's a landing signal officer at the end of the runway waving him off. Burt takes the wave off, and then finally, Burt's had enough. He is going to put the airplane onto that runway. And so he did, putting his one good wheel on the runway. Burt held the Avenger steady and smooth until the wings ran out of lift and she slid off the side into the sand. Burt Ernest and Harry Ferrier are back from their first combat mission. Oh, did I mention Harry Ferrier was 17? I agree with Admiral Nimitz. Burt's flight was an epic in combat aviation. Burt went back to check on Jay Manning, but a big Marine stood in his way. You don't want to go back there, sir. Right about the time Burt is putting 8T1 onto the runway at Midway, John Waldron is leading Torpedo 8 against the Japanese carriers, alone. 15 aircraft go in, 15 aircraft are shot down. Only the pilot of the last aircraft, Ensign George Gay, even got close enough to launch his torpedo, which missed. His rear seat man, Bob Huntington, has been killed by enemy fire, and Gay's aircraft is the last to be shot down. Of 30 men, only George Gay survived, being picked up by a PBY the next day. Gay is quickly sent off to Pearl Harbor to have his wounds treated and then sent on to the States to unwanted fame as the sole survivor of Torpedo 8 at Midway. Well, Burt and Harry, the other sole survivors of Torpedo 8 at Midway, they didn't go back to the States or fame, wanted or unwanted. They went back to the fight. While Harry briefly served aboard the Enterprise, Burt went on to get a torpedo hit against the Japanese carrier Ryujo in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, flying off the carrier Saratoga. At the end of August, 3 weeks after the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the Saratoga took a torpedo hit and the aircraft were all flown off to Espiritu Santo. On the 3rd of September, Harry Ferrier rejoined the squadron and was reunited with Burt. And the only surviving aircraft, 8T1, the first Avenger off the assembly line. People are astounded that this aircraft still flew. She would be sent back to Pearl Harbor, where an 8-page report documented all the battle damage. Later on, she'd be sent off to San Diego and sadly was scrapped later that year. The Navy withdrew the first few surviving Devastators from combat, and we're going to re-equip with Avengers. On the 13th of September, 6 TBFs fly into Cactus, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, and Burt was flying one of them. For the next 3 nights, Guadalcanal was bombarded by Japanese warships. On the 16th of September, Torpedo 8 flew its first mission against Japanese cruisers and destroyers off the island armed with torpedoes. All the subsequent missions they flew, with a few exceptions, they were armed with bombs because there were no torpedoes to be had on Guadalcanal. As Avengers flew up from Espiritu Santo, they could take one torpedo apiece with them, but those were soon exhausted. The men are exhausted too. Japanese Navy continued to pound Cactus almost every night with shell fire. As the Japanese attacks and operational losses took their toll on the Avengers, the ground crews, led by Lieutenant Pete Peterkin and Chief Aviation Machinist Mate Hammond, that's him second from the left on the wing, were working night and day to keep the aircraft in the fight. By mid-October, nearly all of the Avengers had been destroyed. The men of Torpedo 8 found themselves as Airedale Infantry assigned to Weapons Company 7th Marines in the front lines. Chief Hammond went back to work. Using as many as 50 Marines for labor and swapping engines and wings, that's a big wing, between aircraft, Chief Hammond would occasionally be able to get 3 sort of flyable aircraft out of the wreckage. And sometimes 3 of them were actually sort of operational at one time. In the photo, you see one of the donors to the effort. If you look closely, you can see Ensign Ernest painted on below the cockpit with a victory flag. By mid-November, the thoroughly worn-out men of Torpedo 8 were relieved by a Marine Avenger outfit. The last of the men left Guadalcanal on the 16th of November. By the end of November, Torpedo 8 was decommissioned. VT-8 was in commission for about 15 months. The squadron had the highest casualty rate of U.S. Navy squadrons at Midway and at Guadalcanal. The 35 pilots of Torpedo 8 earned 39 Navy crosses. The enlisted men earned over 50 decorations for valor. Avengers had been well proven in combat. They would fly through the war and beyond. Grumman was producing Avengers as fast as they could, along with the F-4F Wildcat fighter. But the Navy needed Grumman to transition to the F-6F Hellcat fighter, and so a meeting was arranged between Grumman and General Motors. Yeah, the car people. GM was now in the airplane business. Now, I'm sure that there was some smack talk between the airplane people and the car people, but it turned out to be one of the most successful industrial collaborations of all time. GM turned out a good product, including this aircraft you see here. The next prototype, the TBF-3, the TBM-3, TBM being the Navy code for General Motors, was put into production, but GM became the sole source of Avengers from that point on. Grumman was out of the Avenger business. The TBM-3E, which is the aircraft you see here, was widely considered to be the most successful of the Avengers, and that's a GM modification that did that. The numbers tell the tale. 3/4 of all of the Avengers, and Wildcats for that matter, were built not by Grumman, but by General Motors. And our friends Bert and Harry both continued to fly in combat, and both survived the war. After Torpedo 8 was decommissioned, Bert was assigned to a composite squadron, flying over 100 more combat missions off the escort carrier USS Manila Bay. After the shooting stop, Bert was assigned to flight test captured enemy aircraft. Surviving the crash of a German Me-262 jet fighter, Bert still had his lucky $2 bill on him. He went on to fly over 1,000 hours in B-17s as a hurricane hunter. That's a pretty sporty job, too. Later assignments included command of an attack squadron, an air group, and an amphibious command ship. After attending the War College, he was assigned to NATO in Paris, good deal, and finally commanded the Naval Air Station at Oceana, Virginia. He lived until 2009, age 91. Harry kept flying in both Avengers and Dauntlesses in Enterprise and Yorktown, the new Yorktown. By 1945, at age 19, Harry was selected for commission as an ensign. He was going to be a career man, but Harry delayed commissioning and flew as a chief throughout the war. They weren't going to let him fly as an ensign. He did later return to commission status and actually made 3 deployments on a helicopter carrier during the Vietnam War. Harry Ferrier retired from active duty as a commander, and later he accompanied the Robert Ballard expedition to find the USS Yorktown, sunk at the Battle of Midway. Harry lived to age 92 in 2016. The TBF in the Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, is marked 8T1. Here are the sources I used in preparing this brief. I highly commend all of them to you. Robert Mrazek's At Dawn Like Thunder is the complete history of Torpedo 8. It's eminently readable and has a lot of stuff that I had to skip over here. Second book from the right at the top row is Shattered Sword. I actually had not read that book until I started to prepare for this brief, and it's an amazing resource. I highly recommend that if you're a total Midway geek like I am, because while I didn't really use Incredible Victory in preparing for this, I read the book when it first came out. I was in 7th grade. It promoted an interest in Midway that exists to this day. And the websites are all highly useful. Most of those photos of the guys who flew with Torpedo 8 on the 4th of June came from Find a Grave. With that, my briefing is complete.